The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus Thompson adjusted his hard hat and checked his watch. 7:30 sharp. He had been working construction for 15 years, and punctuality was something he prided himself on. The steel beams gleamed in the early light, and the familiar sounds of machinery and shouting workers filled the air. It was going to be another ordinary day, or so he thought. Marcus was a 42-year-old father of three, known among his crew for his steady hands and calm demeanor. He had worked on skyscrapers, bridges, and residential complexes throughout the city. His weathered hands told the story of countless hours spent wielding tools, lifting heavy materials, and ensuring every bolt was properly secured. Safety was always his top priority, not just for himself, but for everyone on the site. The project they were working on was a new office building in downtown Chicago. 23 stories of concrete, steel, and glass that would eventually house hundreds of office workers. Marcus was part of the team responsible for installing the structural framework on the upper floors. It was demanding work that required focus, strength, and an unwavering attention to detail. As he made his way to the elevator that would take him to the 18th floor, Marcus nodded to his fellow workers. There was Jimmy, the crane operator who had been doing this job longer than anyone could remember. Sarah, one of the few women on the crew, was already suited up and ready to go. She was tough as nails and could outwork most of the men on the site. Then, there was Rodriguez, the foreman, a man whose booming voice could be heard 3 blocks away when he needed to get everyone's attention. The elevator creaked as it made its way up, carrying Marcus and 5 other workers to their assigned floor. The view from up there was breathtaking. The city stretched out in all directions, with morning traffic creating rivers of light along the major highways. Marcus had seen this view hundreds of times, but it never got old. There was something about being up high, building something that would last for decades, that gave him a sense of purpose and pride. The work began as it always did. Tools were distributed, safety harnesses were checked twice, and Rodriguez went over the day's assignments. They would be installing a series of steel beams that would form the skeleton for the building's eastern wall. It was precision work that required coordination between the ground crew, the crane operator, and the workers on the floor. Marcus had been paired with Tony Castellano, a newer member of the crew who had been working construction for only 3 years. Tony was eager and hardworking, but he sometimes let his enthusiasm get ahead of his caution. Marcus had taken it upon himself to mentor the younger man, teaching him the tricks of the trade and, more importantly, how to stay safe in an environment where one mistake could be fatal. "Remember what I told you about checking your harness?" Marcus called out to Tony as they prepared to guide a massive steel beam into position. The beam, weighing several tons, was being lifted by Jimmy's crane from the ground level. Their job was to help guide it into place and secure it with bolts that would hold it there permanently. Tony nodded and gave his harness an extra tug. "Got it, Marcus. Safety first, right?" "Every single time," Marcus replied with a smile. "Your wife and kids want you coming home tonight, and so do mine." The beam was making its way up slowly, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. This was always the most dangerous part of the operation. The beam was heavy enough to cause serious damage if something went wrong, and the workers had to position themselves carefully to guide it without putting themselves in harm's way. Marcus had done this hundreds of times before. He knew exactly where to stand, how to read the crane operator's signals, and when to move out of the way if something didn't look right. But today felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the wind, which seemed to be picking up more than the weather report had predicted. Maybe it was the fact that they were behind schedule and everyone was feeling the pressure to work faster. As the beam approached their level, Marcus and Tony moved into position. They each held guide ropes that would help them direct the beam to its proper location. The crane operator's signals were clear and precise. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. That's when Marcus felt it. A sharp pain in his chest that seemed to come out of nowhere. It started as a dull ache but quickly intensified into something that took his breath away. He tried to ignore it at first, thinking it might just be muscle strain from lifting heavy materials all morning. But the pain kept getting worse, and now it was spreading down his left arm. Marcus had heard about heart attacks, of course. He knew the warning signs. But he was only 42, in good physical shape, and had no history of heart problems. This couldn't be happening to him, not now, not here, 18 floors above the ground while guiding a multi-ton steel beam. He tried to signal to Tony, but the words wouldn't come out. The pain was overwhelming now, and he could feel his knees starting to buckle. The guide rope slipped from his hands as he clutched his chest, trying to breathe through the agony that was coursing through his body. Tony noticed something was wrong immediately. "Marcus! What's happening? Are you okay?" But Marcus wasn't okay. The world was starting to spin around him, and he could feel himself losing consciousness. The last thing he remembered was Tony's panicked voice calling for help and the sound of the steel beam swaying dangerously overhead as it lost one of its guides. Rodriguez was the first to respond to Tony's shouts. The foreman had been supervising another part of the operation when he heard the commotion. He rushed over to find Marcus collapsed on the steel decking, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Get that beam secured now," Rodriguez shouted to the other workers before kneeling down beside Marcus. He checked for a pulse and found one, but it was weak and irregular. "Jimmy, bring that crane to a safe position and shut it down. Everyone else, clear the area." The construction site, which had been bustling with activity just moments before, suddenly became a scene of controlled chaos. Workers who had been focused on their individual tasks now turned their attention to their fallen colleague. Some helped secure the abandoned steel beam while others cleared space around Marcus. Rodriguez grabbed his radio and called down to the site office. "We need an ambulance up here right now. Marcus is down, looks like a heart attack. Tell them they'll need to get to the 18th floor." The response came back immediately. Emergency services had been contacted and were on their way. But getting paramedics to the 18th floor of an unfinished building was going to be a challenge. The regular elevators weren't operational yet, and the construction elevator could only carry a limited number of people at a time. Sarah, who had some basic first aid training, knelt down beside Marcus and checked his vital signs. His pulse was getting weaker, and his skin was becoming clammy to the touch. "We need to get him down to ground level," she said. "The paramedics are going to need room to work." But moving Marcus was risky. If he was having a heart attack, any unnecessary movement could make things worse. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to keep him where he was until professional help arrived. "We wait for the paramedics," he said firmly. "They'll know how to move him safely." Down on the street level, the sound of sirens was getting closer. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars were converging on the construction site. The emergency response was swift and professional, but everyone knew that time was of the essence when dealing with a heart attack. Captain Rodriguez, no relation to the construction foreman, was the first paramedic to arrive on scene. He was a veteran of 20 years with the Chicago Fire Department, and he had seen his share of construction site emergencies. But getting to a patient on the 18th floor of an unfinished building presented unique challenges. "How many people can that construction elevator hold?" he asked the site supervisor, a man named Peterson who had rushed out to meet the emergency crews. "4 people maximum, including the operator," Peterson replied. "It's not designed for heavy loads or emergency transport." Captain Rodriguez made quick calculations in his head. He would need to take essential equipment up with him, but he'd have to leave most of his team on the ground. This was going to be a challenging rescue, even under the best circumstances. Meanwhile, 18 floors above, Marcus was drifting in and out of consciousness. When he was aware, the pain in his chest was excruciating. When he wasn't, he found himself in a strange, dreamlike state where time seemed to move differently. He could hear voices around him, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. Tony stayed by his side, talking to him constantly. "Stay with us, Marcus. Help is coming. Think about your kids, man. Think about going home tonight." But Marcus was thinking about his kids, and that was part of what made this so terrifying. His oldest daughter, Emma, was starting high school in the fall. His son, Jake, had just made the Little League All-Star team. And little Sophie was only 6 years old. She still believed her daddy could fix anything and protect her from any danger. What would happen to them if he didn't make it through this? His wife, Laura, was a teacher, and, while she was strong and capable, the thought of leaving her to raise 3 children alone was unbearable. He had always imagined he would be there for all the important moments in his kids' lives. Their graduations, their weddings, holding his grandchildren someday. The construction elevator finally arrived at the 18th floor, carrying Captain Rodriguez and one other paramedic, along with essential medical equipment. They moved quickly but carefully across the steel decking to where Marcus lay. Rodriguez knelt down and immediately began his assessment. He checked Marcus's pulse, blood pressure, and breathing. The signs were not encouraging. "Looks like a massive myocardial infarction," he told his partner, using the medical term for heart attack. "We need to get him stabilized and down to the ambulance as quickly as possible." They worked with practiced efficiency, starting in 4-line and administering medication to help his heart function. An oxygen mask was placed over Marcus's face, and they attached a portable heart monitor to track his vital signs. The readings were concerning. His heart was struggling, and his blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. "We need to get him to the hospital now," Rodriguez said. But, even as he spoke, Marcus's heart monitor began showing irregular patterns. His heart was going into an abnormal rhythm, a condition that could be fatal if not corrected immediately. The paramedic prepared a defibrillator while Rodriguez continued CPR. They were fighting for Marcus's life 18 floors above the ground, with limited equipment and no backup. It was every emergency responder's nightmare scenario, but they were determined to save this man's life. Down in the ambulance bay, the rest of the emergency team was preparing for the worst-case scenario. Additional paramedics, doctors from the nearby trauma center, and even a helicopter crew were standing by. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Marcus Thompson would survive to see his family again. The construction workers had gathered on the lower floors, watching and waiting for news about their colleague. These were tough men who dealt with danger every day, but seeing one of their own fighting for his life had shaken everyone. They stood in small groups, talking quietly and offering prayers for Marcus and his family. Rodriguez worked frantically to stabilize Marcus's condition enough for transport. The irregular heart rhythm was getting worse, and they were running out of time. "We need to move now," he told his partner. "Call down and have them clear the elevator. We're coming down." The ride down seemed to take forever. 18 floors had never felt so far. Marcus was unconscious now, and his vital signs were weak. Rodriguez continued chest compressions while his partner managed the 4 medications and oxygen. They were doing everything they could, but sometimes it wasn't enough. As the elevator reached the ground floor, a full medical team was waiting. Marcus was quickly transferred to a gurney and wheeled toward the waiting ambulance. The race against time was intensifying, and everyone involved knew that the next few minutes would be critical. But, as they lifted Marcus into the ambulance, his heart monitor suddenly showed a flat line. His heart had stopped beating entirely. Captain Rodriguez looked at the monitor and felt his own heart sink. They had lost him. That's when he heard the voice that would change everything. From behind him, a quiet paramedic who had been working silently stepped forward. His name was David Chen, and he had been on the force for only 2 years. Most people barely noticed him because he rarely spoke during emergencies. But, what he lacked in words, he made up for in skill and determination. "Let me try something," David said quietly, stepping up to Marcus's motionless form. And what happened next would be talked about in the fire department for years to come. David Chen had always been different from his colleagues in the Chicago Fire Department. While other paramedics were quick to take charge and bark out orders during emergencies, David worked quietly in the background, observing everything and speaking only when absolutely necessary. His fellow firefighters sometimes joked that he was like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without anyone really noticing him. But those who worked closely with David knew better. Behind his quiet exterior was a brilliant medical mind and an intuitive understanding of emergency medicine that seemed almost supernatural. He could spot symptoms that others missed, anticipate complications before they happened, and somehow remain calm in situations that would rattle even veteran responders. David had grown up in Chicago's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who had come to America with nothing but hope and determination. His father worked 16-hour days in a restaurant kitchen, while his mother cleaned office buildings at night to help make ends meet. They had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they had never had. From an early age, David had been fascinated by medicine. While other kids played video games or watched television, he would spend hours reading medical textbooks that he borrowed from the public library. He memorized anatomy charts and studied case histories of rare diseases. His parents thought it was just a phase, but David knew he had found his calling. When he graduated from high school, David had been accepted to several prestigious universities. But his family couldn't afford the tuition, and he didn't want to burden them with debt. Instead, he enrolled in community college and worked part-time jobs to pay his way through school. It took him longer than most to complete his education, but he never lost sight of his goal. After earning his paramedic certification, David joined the fire department with dreams of eventually becoming a doctor. He saw his work as a paramedic as valuable training for his future career in medicine. Every emergency call was a learning opportunity, and every patient was a chance to hone his skills. But David's quiet nature sometimes worked against him in a profession that often rewarded bold action and quick decision-making. While his medical knowledge was exceptional, he struggled with the leadership aspects of emergency response. He preferred to work behind the scenes, supporting more experienced paramedics rather than taking charge himself. Captain Rodriguez had noticed David's unique abilities early on. The young paramedic had an almost uncanny ability to sense when a patient's condition was about to change. He would quietly suggest interventions that often proved to be exactly what was needed. Rodriguez had tried to encourage David to be more assertive, but the young man seemed content to remain in the background. On this particular morning, David had been assigned to work with Captain Rodriguez on what was supposed to be a routine shift. They had already responded to 2 minor calls, an elderly woman who had fallen in her apartment but wasn't seriously injured, and a fender bender where nobody was hurt but one driver was having panic attacks. When the call came in about the construction site emergency, David had quietly gathered the necessary equipment while Rodriguez coordinated with other units. He knew from experience that construction site accidents often involved serious injuries, and he mentally prepared himself for what they might find. During the ride to the scene, Rodriguez had briefed him on what they knew. A construction worker, 42 years old, apparent heart attack, 18 floors up in an unfinished building. It was going to be a challenging rescue under the best of circumstances. As they arrived at the construction site, David quickly assessed the situation. The building's unfinished state meant they would have limited access to the patient. The construction elevator could only carry a few people at a time, and there was no telling what kind of medical emergency they would find when they reached the 18th floor. David had loaded essential emergency equipment into a large duffel bag while Rodriguez coordinated with the site supervisor. He included everything they might need for a cardiac emergency, medications, for supplies, oxygen, and a portable defibrillator. But he also added some items that weren't on the standard emergency response list, things that his intuition told him might be needed. The ride up in the construction elevator had been tense. Rodriguez was focused on the logistical challenges they would face, but David was thinking about the patient they were about to treat. A 42-year-old construction worker having a heart attack was unusual but not unheard of. Stress, physical demands of the job, and sometimes underlying health conditions could all contribute to cardiac events in younger men. When they reached the 18th floor, David's first impression was how exposed and vulnerable the patient looked lying on the steel decking. Marcus Thompson was pale and barely conscious, surrounded by worried co-workers who were trying to help but didn't really know what to do. While Rodriguez took charge of the scene and began his primary assessment, David quietly observed everything around them. He noticed the patient's positioning, the color of his skin, the way his chest was rising and falling. But he also noticed things that others might miss: the slight blue tint around the patient's lips, the way his hands were positioned, the irregular pattern of his breathing. David's medical training had taught him to look for these subtle signs that could indicate the severity of a patient's condition. What he saw told him that Marcus Thompson was in serious trouble. This wasn't just a minor heart attack or anxiety attack. This man was having a massive cardiac event that was threatening his life. As Rodriguez worked to establish for access and administer medications, David quietly prepared additional equipment. He set up the cardiac monitor and attached the leads to Marcus's chest. The reading that appeared on the screen confirmed his worst fears. The patient was in ventricular tachycardia, a dangerous heart rhythm that could quickly deteriorate into cardiac arrest. "Captain," David said quietly, "we need to prepare for defibrillation." Rodriguez glanced at the monitor and nodded grimly. David was right, as usual. The patient's heart was beating too fast and too irregularly to pump blood effectively. Without intervention, he would go into full cardiac arrest within minutes. David began setting up the defibrillator while Rodriguez continued trying to stabilize the patient with medications. But, even as they worked, Marcus's condition continued to deteriorate. His blood pressure was dropping, his oxygen saturation was falling, and his heart rhythm was becoming more erratic. "We need to get him down to the ambulance," Rodriguez said. "Can you handle the portable equipment during transport?" David nodded and began packing the essential gear into a transport bag. Moving a critical patient down 18 floors was going to be extremely challenging, but staying on the construction site wasn't an option. They needed to get Marcus to a hospital as quickly as possible. The trip down in the construction elevator was a nightmare. The elevator swayed and jerked as it descended, making it difficult to maintain steady chest compressions or monitor the patient's vital signs. David found himself wedged into a corner of the elevator, trying to keep the portable defibrillator steady while Rodriguez worked on the patient. Halfway down, Marcus's heart rhythm changed again, this time for the worse. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic rhythm where the heart quivers uselessly instead of pumping blood. This was the kind of emergency that required immediate defibrillation. "Charging to 200 joules, David said as he prepared the defibrillator. In the confined space of the construction elevator, everyone had to be careful not to touch the patient or any metal surfaces when the shock was delivered. "Clear," Rodriguez called out, and David delivered the first shock. Marcus's body jerked with the electrical current, but when they checked the monitor, his heart was still in ventricular fibrillation. They would need to try again. "Charging to 300 joules, David said, increasing the power of the defibrillator. Sometimes it took multiple shocks to restore a normal heart rhythm, and they were running out of time. The second shock also failed to restore a normal rhythm. Marcus was essentially dead now, his heart no longer pumping blood to his brain and vital organs. They had maybe a few more minutes before irreversible brain damage would begin to occur. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, a full medical team was waiting. Marcus was quickly transferred to a gurney and wheeled toward the waiting ambulance. David gathered his equipment and followed, but he could see from the expressions on everyone's faces that they were losing hope. As they loaded Marcus into the ambulance, the cardiac monitor suddenly went flat. His heart had stopped beating entirely. Rodriguez immediately began chest compressions while another paramedic prepared medications, but David could see that their standard resuscitation efforts weren't working. "How long has he been down?" asked Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency physician who had responded to provide additional support. "Approximately 8 minutes since the last shock," Rodriguez replied, continuing chest compressions. No response to standard ACLS protocols. David knew what that meant. After 10 minutes without a heartbeat, the chances of successful resuscitation dropped dramatically. Most emergency responders would begin thinking about calling the time of death soon. But something inside David wouldn't accept that outcome. He had been studying Marcus's condition throughout the entire rescue, and his intuition was telling him that there was still hope. The man was young and had been in good health before this incident. His body might still be fighting, even if conventional monitoring equipment couldn't detect it. "Let me try something," David said quietly, stepping forward. Rodriguez looked up from his chest compressions, sweat beading on his forehead. "David, we've tried everything in the protocol. It's been almost 10 minutes. Please," David said, his voice barely above a whisper.
just give me a chance." There was something in David's tone that made Rodriguez step aside.
The young paramedic had never asked to take charge of a resuscitation before, and his quiet confidence was compelling. David knelt beside Marcus's still form and placed his hands on the man's chest. But, instead of beginning standard chest compressions, he did something that surprised everyone watching. He closed his eyes and seemed to listen with his hands, as if he were trying to sense something that couldn't be detected by machines.
"David, what are you doing?" Dr. Martinez asked.
She had worked with many paramedics over the years, but she had never seen anything like this.
"His heart is still fighting," David said quietly, his eyes still closed.
"I can feel it trying to beat, but it's not strong enough. The electrical activity is there, but it's too weak to register on the monitor." He began chest compressions, but they were different from the standard technique. Instead of the rapid, forceful pumps that were typically used, David's compressions were slower and more deliberate. He seemed to be feeling for something with each compression, adjusting his technique based on feedback that only he could sense. "This is unconventional," Dr. Martinez said, but she didn't tell him to stop. There was something about David's quiet confidence that made her want to see what he would do next. After 2 minutes of these unusual chest compressions, David reached for the defibrillator. But, instead of charging it to the maximum power setting, he set it to a much lower level than anyone would normally use for ventricular fibrillation.
"David, that's not enough power," Rodriguez said.
"If we're going to shock him again, we need to use at least 300 joules. "Trust me," David said, and there was something in his voice that made everyone in the ambulance go quiet. "His heart is ready now.
Too much power will damage the tissue that's trying to recover."
He placed the defibrillator paddles on Marcus's chest and looked around to make sure everyone was clear.
"Shocking at 150 joules.
He pressed the button, and Marcus's body jerked with the electrical current.
For a moment, nothing happened.
The cardiac monitor remained flat, showing no signs of life. Then, suddenly, a single blip appeared on the screen.
Then, another. And another.
"I've got a rhythm," Dr. Martinez said, her voice filled with amazement.
"Weak, but it's there."
David immediately resumed his modified chest compressions, but now he was working with the heart instead of trying to force it to beat. The rhythm on the monitor grew stronger with each compression, and Marcus's skin color began to improve.
"Blood pressure is coming up," Rodriguez said, checking the portable monitor. "Oxygen saturation is improving too."
Within 5 minutes, Marcus had a stable heart rhythm and was breathing on his own. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around the ambulance with confusion.
Where am I?" he whispered. "You're in an ambulance," David said gently.
"You had a heart attack at work, but you're going to be okay now."
As they rushed toward the hospital, Dr. Martinez pulled David aside.
"How did you know to do that?"
"That technique you used. I've never seen anything like it."
David was quiet for a long moment, as if he was trying to find the right words. "I could feel his heart trying to beat," he finally said. "It was like it was asking for help, but everyone was trying to force it instead of listening to what it needed."
Dr. Martinez shook her head in amazement. "You saved his life with something that's not in any textbook."
But David was already turning his attention back to Marcus, monitoring his vital signs and making sure he remained stable during transport. He had done what he came to do, and now it was time to get this man to the hospital where surgeons could repair the damage to his heart.
As they pulled into the emergency bay at Chicago General Hospital, Marcus was alert and talking.
His heart rhythm was stable, his blood pressure was normal, and his oxygen levels had returned to the normal range. By all accounts, he had made a miraculous recovery from what should have been a fatal heart attack. But the story was far from over. As word of David's unusual resuscitation technique spread through the hospital, medical professionals began asking questions. How had a quiet paramedic with only 2 years of experience managed to save a patient who had been clinically dead for over 10 minutes? The answer to that question would lead to revelations about David Chen that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. His quiet demeanor and humble background hid secrets that would soon change how people looked at emergency medicine and the power of intuition in saving lives. But, for now, Marcus Thompson was alive, and that was all that mattered to the construction workers' family who were racing to the hospital, praying that they wouldn't be too late to say goodbye to the man they loved. Laura Thompson received the phone call that every spouse dreads at exactly 10:47 a.m. while she was teaching her second-grade class about addition and subtraction. The school secretary knocked on her classroom door with a grave expression that immediately told Laura something was terribly wrong. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to take this call immediately," the secretary said, handing her the phone. "It's about your husband." Laura's hands trembled as she took the phone, her mind racing through all the possible scenarios. Marcus worked construction, and she had always known that accidents could happen. But, in 15 years of marriage, she had never received a call like this. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Rodriguez from the Chicago Fire Department. Your husband has been taken to Chicago General Hospital. He suffered a heart attack at work, but he's stable now and conscious." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. Marcus was only 42 years old and seemed to be in perfect health. He exercised regularly, ate well, and had never had any heart problems. How could this be happening? "I'll be right there," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The school secretary was already making arrangements for a substitute teacher to take over her class. During the 20-minute drive to the hospital, Laura's mind was filled with questions and fears. What if Marcus didn't make it? What would she tell the children? Emma was in school, Jake was at his friend's house for a playdate, and little Sophie was at daycare. They had no idea that their father was fighting for his life. When Laura arrived at Chicago General, she was directed to the cardiac intensive care unit. The hospital corridors seemed endless as she hurried toward the elevator, her heart pounding with anxiety and fear. She had been to this hospital before when the children were born, but never under circumstances like these. Dr. Sarah Martinez was waiting for her in the family consultation room, along with a nurse and a social worker. Laura could tell from their expressions that they had serious news to share, and she braced herself for the worst. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Martinez. I was with your husband during his transport to the hospital," the doctor began. "I want you to know that he's alive and stable, but what happened today was very serious." Laura felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "How serious? Is he going to be okay?" "Your husband suffered what we call a massive myocardial infarction, or heart attack. His heart stopped beating for over 10 minutes, which is usually fatal. The fact that he's alive and conscious right now is honestly miraculous." Dr. Martinez went on to explain that Marcus would need emergency surgery to clear the blocked artery that had caused the heart attack. The procedure was called a cardiac catheterization, and it would involve inserting a small balloon to open the blocked vessel and placing a stent to keep it open. "The surgery itself is routine," Dr. Martinez continued, "but your husband's case is unusual because of how severe his heart attack was and how long he was without a heartbeat. We're optimistic, but I want you to understand that the next 24 hours will be critical." Laura nodded, trying to process all the medical information while dealing with the emotional shock of nearly losing her husband. "Can I see him?" "Of course. He's been asking for you." When Laura entered Marcus's room in the cardiac ICU, she was shocked by how pale and fragile he looked. Machines surrounded his bed, monitoring his heart rhythm, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. Multiple 4 lines ran into his arms, and he was wearing an oxygen mask that covered most of his face. But when Marcus saw her, his eyes lit up with relief and love. He reached out his hand, and Laura took it gently, afraid that she might hurt him. "Hey there, beautiful," Marcus whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably him. "Sorry to scare you like this." Laura couldn't hold back her tears any longer. "Don't you dare apologize," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm just so grateful you're alive. When they called, I thought." "I know," Marcus said softly. "I thought the same thing for a while there. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We've got too much left to do together." Laura stayed by his side as the medical team prepared him for surgery. Dr. James Richardson, the cardiac surgeon who would be performing the procedure, stopped by to explain what would happen and answer any questions. The good news is that your husband's heart muscle appears to have suffered minimal permanent damage, Dr. Richardson explained.
That's extremely unusual given how long he was in cardiac arrest.
Usually, we see significant tissue death after that length of time without oxygen.
Why didn't that happen? Laura asked.
Honestly, we're not entirely sure, the surgeon admitted. The paramedic who revived him used some unconventional techniques that seemed to keep blood flowing to his heart even when it wasn't beating normally.
It's something we'll want to study more carefully.
As they wheeled Marcus away for surgery, Laura found herself alone in the waiting room with her thoughts and fears. She called her sister to pick up the children and explain what was happening in age-appropriate terms. Then, she called Marcus's construction crew to let them know how he was doing. Rodriguez, the construction foreman, assured her that the entire crew was pulling for Marcus and that they would handle all the paperwork and insurance issues so she wouldn't have to worry about anything except her husband's recovery. The surgery took 3 hours, which felt like 3 years to Laura. She paced the waiting room, called family members with updates, and tried to read magazines, but nothing could distract her from the anxiety of not knowing what was happening in the operating room. When Dr. Richardson finally emerged, he was smiling, which Laura took as a good sign. The surgery went very well, he announced. We were able to clear the blockage completely and install a stent to keep the artery open.
Your husband's heart function is surprisingly good considering what he went through.
Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her.
So he's going to be okay? The prognosis is excellent.
He'll need to make some lifestyle changes and take medications to prevent future heart problems, but there's no reason he can't live a normal, active life. As Marcus recovered from the anesthesia, Laura sat by his bedside and thought about how close she had come to losing him. The doctors kept mentioning how unusual his case was and how lucky he was to be alive. But Laura knew that luck alone hadn't saved her husband's life. The next morning, Captain Rodriguez from the fire department stopped by to check on Marcus. With him was David Chen, the young paramedic who had been part of the rescue team. Laura had heard bits and pieces about what had happened during the rescue, but she wanted to thank the people who had saved her husband's life. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that your husband is alive today because of the exceptional work of my team, Captain Rodriguez said. Particularly David here. What he did yesterday was beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of emergency medicine. David looked uncomfortable with the praise and tried to deflect attention from himself.
We all worked together, he said quietly. I was just doing my job.
But Captain Rodriguez wasn't going to let David's modesty diminish what had happened.
David, what you did wasn't standard protocol.
You saved this man's life using techniques that aren't in any textbook.
Laura looked at the young paramedic with new interest.
He was probably in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed unusual for someone in such a high-stress profession.
Thank you, she said simply.
I don't know what you did, but my children still have their father because of you. David nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But Laura noticed something else about him, something that reminded her of her husband. There was a quiet strength and competence that didn't need to announce itself. After the firefighters left, Dr. Martinez returned to discuss Marcus's case with a colleague, Dr. Robert Kimura, who was a specialist in emergency cardiology.
Laura overheard parts of their conversation that piqued her curiosity. I've never seen anything like the technique that paramedic used, Dr. Kimura was saying.
He seemed to know exactly what the heart needed, even when our monitors couldn't detect any electrical activity.
He said he could feel the heart trying to beat, Dr. Martinez replied.
I thought it was just intuition at first, but the results speak for themselves.
Maybe there's something to be learned from his approach.
That afternoon, word of Marcus's miraculous recovery began to spread through the hospital. Medical students and residents found excuses to stop by the cardiac unit to hear about the unusual case. Everyone wanted to know more about the paramedic who had brought a man back from the dead using unconventional methods. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the head of the emergency medicine department, decided to investigate further. She had heard similar stories about David Chen from other doctors who had worked with him in the field. There seemed to be a pattern of unusual successes when David was involved in difficult cases.
Dr. Harper pulled David's personnel file and discovered some interesting facts about his background.
He had scored in the top 1% on his paramedic certification exams, and his written reports showed an unusually sophisticated understanding of cardiac physiology. But what really caught her attention were the comments from supervisors about his almost supernatural ability to predict when patients were about to take a turn for the worse. She decided to have a conversation with the young paramedic to learn more about his background and training. When David arrived at her office, he seemed nervous and uncertain about why he had been called in. "David, I want to talk to you about yesterday's rescue," Dr. Harper began. "Several witnesses have described techniques that you used that aren't part of standard emergency protocols. Can you tell me where you learned them?" David was quiet for a long moment, as if he was deciding how much to reveal. "Some of it came from my traditional training," he finally said. "But some of it came from other sources." "What other sources?" Dr. Harper prompted gently. David looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "My grandfather was a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner in Taiwan before my family came to America. He taught me about energy flow and how to sense the life force in people's bodies." Dr. Harper leaned forward with interest. "Are you saying that you used traditional Chinese medicine techniques during the resuscitation?" "Not exactly," David replied. "But my grandfather taught me how to feel for the qi, the life energy, in a person's body. When I was working on Mr. Thompson, I could sense that his heart was trying to beat, even when the machine said it wasn't working." This revelation opened up entirely new possibilities for Dr. Harper. She had heard of traditional Chinese medicine practitioners who claimed to be able to diagnose illness by feeling for energy patterns in the body, but she had never seen it apply to emergency medicine. "David, would you be willing to work with our research department to study these techniques?" she asked. "What you did yesterday saved a man's life, and if we could understand it better, it might help us save other lives too." David nodded slowly. "If it could help people, then, yes, I'd be willing to try." Over the next several days, as Marcus continued to recover, David began working with the hospital's research team to document his techniques. They used sensitive monitoring equipment to see if they could detect what David was sensing when he examined patients. The results were remarkable. David could consistently identify changes in patients' conditions several minutes before standard monitoring equipment could detect them. His hands seemed to be picking up subtle vibrations and energy patterns that conventional medicine had never acknowledged. Dr. Harper realized that they were on the verge of a breakthrough that could revolutionize emergency medicine. David's combination of traditional Chinese medicine knowledge and modern paramedic training had created something entirely new and potentially invaluable. But, as word of David's abilities spread, it also attracted attention from people who weren't interested in advancing medical science. Some saw opportunity in David's unusual skills, and they were willing to go to great lengths to exploit those abilities for their own purposes. The quiet paramedic who had saved Marcus Thompson's life was about to find himself at the center of a much larger and more dangerous situation than he had ever imagined. And Marcus, still recovering from his brush with death, would soon find that his life had been saved for a reason that went far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The foundation for everything that was about to happen had been laid in those critical moments when David Chen had placed his hands on a dying man's chest and felt the spark of life that everyone else had missed. But neither David nor Marcus had any idea of the extraordinary journey that lay ahead of them. 3 weeks after Marcus Thompson's miraculous recovery, David Chen was sitting in his small apartment in Chinatown, trying to make sense of how his life had suddenly become so complicated. The phone had been ringing constantly with calls from medical researchers, news reporters, and people claiming to represent various organizations that wanted to study his unusual abilities. David had always preferred the quiet anonymity of his work as a paramedic, but that was no longer possible. Word of Marcus's recovery and David's role in it had spread far beyond Chicago General Hospital. Medical journals were requesting case studies, television producers wanted to feature him in documentaries, and several universities had offered him research positions. But there were other calls too, ones that made David uncomfortable. People who seemed to know more about traditional Chinese medicine than they should, and who asked questions that suggested they understood exactly what David had done during the resuscitation. These callers didn't identify themselves clearly, and their interests seemed to go beyond academic curiosity. David's grandfather had warned him about this when he was younger. The old ways attract attention from many different people, the elderly man had said during one of their training sessions. Some seek knowledge to help others, but some seek power to help only themselves. You must be very careful about who you trust with these secrets. At the time, David had been only 16 and more interested in getting into medical school than learning about ancient Chinese healing practices. His grandfather had insisted on teaching him anyway, saying that the knowledge had been passed down through their family for generations and it was David's responsibility to carry it forward. Now, sitting in his apartment with his phone turned off and the curtains drawn, David wondered if he should have listened more carefully to his grandfather's warnings. The old man had passed away 5 years ago, taking with him decades of wisdom about the traditional practices that David was only beginning to understand. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. David wasn't expecting anyone, and he had stopped answering unexpected visitors after a particularly aggressive reporter had tried to force his way into the apartment building the previous day. "David? It's Dr. Harper from the hospital," came a familiar voice from the hallway. "I have someone with me who I think you should meet." David opened the door cautiously and found Dr. Harper standing in the hallway with an elderly Chinese woman who looked to be in her 70s. The woman was small and frail in appearance, but her eyes held an intelligence and intensity that reminded David of his grandfather. "David, this is Dr. Li Wei," Dr. Harper said. "She's a researcher who has been studying the integration of traditional Chinese medicine with modern medical practices. I thought you two should meet." Dr. Li stepped forward and studied David's face carefully before speaking. "You are Chen Weiming's grandson," she said in Mandarin. "You have his eyes and his gift." David was startled to hear his grandfather's Chinese name. Very few people in America had known his grandfather by that name, and David hadn't heard it spoken in years. "You knew my grandfather?" David replied in Mandarin. "We studied together many years ago, before either of us came to America," Dr. Li replied. "He wrote to me about his grandson who was studying medicine in Chicago. He was very proud of you." Dr. Harper looked between the two of them with interest. "I'm going to leave you two to talk," she said. "David, Dr. Li has some information that I think you'll find very interesting." After Dr. Harper left, Dr. Li settled herself in David's small living room and accepted a cup of tea. She looked around the apartment, taking in the medical textbooks, the certificates on the wall, and the small shrine that David had built to honor his grandfather's memory. "Your grandfather left some things with me before he died," Dr. Li said. "He asked me to give them to you when the time was right. I believe that time has come." She opened a cloth bag and removed a collection of old journals written in Chinese characters, along with several ancient-looking medical instruments that David had never seen before. "These contain the complete records of your family's healing traditions," Dr. Li explained. "Techniques that have been refined over hundreds of years and passed down from master to student. Your grandfather began teaching you, but he died before your training was complete." David opened one of the journals and found page after page of detailed drawings and descriptions of various healing techniques. Some of them looked familiar from his childhood lessons with his grandfather, but others were completely new to him. "Why are you giving me these now?" David asked. "Because there are people who know about your family's abilities, and they are not all benevolent," Dr. Li replied gravely. "Your grandfather feared this day would come. The techniques you used to save that man's life were seen by many people, and word has spread to those who would use such knowledge for their own purposes." Dr. Li went on to explain that there were organizations, both legitimate and illegitimate, that collected information about people with unusual abilities. Some were researchers genuinely interested in advancing medical science, but others were more interested in exploiting such abilities for profit or power. "What kind of organizations?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on some of the strange phone calls he had been receiving. "Government agencies, private corporations, criminal organizations," Dr. Li replied. Anyone who might benefit from having someone who can diagnose illness without machines or save lives using methods that conventional medicine cannot explain. David felt a chill run down his spine. He had never thought about his grandfather's teachings as anything more than traditional family knowledge, but now he was beginning to understand that they might represent something much more significant and, potentially dangerous. "What should I do?" he asked. "Continue your studies," Dr. Lee replied. "Learn everything your grandfather wanted to teach you. But be very careful about who you share this knowledge with, and never allow yourself to be controlled by those who would use your gifts for the wrong purposes." That evening, David called Marcus Thompson's house to check on his recovery. He had been doing this regularly since Marcus had been discharged from the hospital, partly out of professional concern and partly because he felt a connection to the man whose life he had saved. "David, how are you doing?" Marcus answered the phone with his usual enthusiasm. "Laura and I were just talking about you. How are you feeling?" David asked. "Any chest pain or shortness of breath?" "Nothing at all," Marcus replied. "The doctors say my heart function is completely normal now. It's like the whole thing never happened, except for this little scar from the surgery." David was pleased to hear that Marcus was doing so well, but he also had something more serious to discuss. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. Have you had any strange phone calls or visitors since you got home from the hospital?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Actually, yes," Marcus said slowly. "A couple of people have called saying they're researchers who want to interview me about my recovery. And, yesterday, someone came by the house claiming to be from the fire department, but Rodriguez told me that no one from the department was planning to visit." This confirmed David's fears. If people were approaching Marcus as well as himself, it meant that someone was taking a systematic interest in what had happened during the rescue. "Marcus, I want you to be very careful about who you talk to," David said. "Don't give out any personal information, and if anyone makes you uncomfortable, call the police immediately." "What's this all about, David? You're starting to scare me." David wasn't sure how much he should explain, but he felt that Marcus deserved to know what was happening. "Some people are very interested in the techniques I use to revive you, and they might try to use you to get to me. I just want you to be safe." After he hung up, David spent the evening reading through his grandfather's journals with new urgency. The techniques described in the ancient texts were far more advanced than anything he had learned during his childhood lessons. There were methods for diagnosing diseases that wouldn't show symptoms for months, techniques for accelerating healing, and even procedures for what the journals called communication with the dying spirit. As he read, David began to understand why Dr. Lee had warned him about people who might want to exploit these abilities. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could be used to harm people as easily as to heal them. Someone who could sense life energy could presumably also learn to disrupt it. The next morning, David returned to work at the fire station, hoping that his regular routine would help him feel more normal. But Captain Rodriguez pulled him aside as soon as he arrived. "David, we need to talk," Rodriguez said, leading him into the office. "I've been getting calls from people asking about you and about what happened during the Thompson rescue. Some of them claim to be from medical organizations, but something doesn't feel right about them." Rodriguez went on to explain that several of the callers had asked detailed questions about David's background, his training, and his family history. They seemed to know more about David than they should, and their questions suggested they were looking for something specific. "I haven't told them anything," Rodriguez assured him. "But I think you should know that people are asking about you." David nodded grimly. "It's not just you, Captain. They've been calling me too, and they've even approached Marcus Thompson." "What do you think they want?" "I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think it's anything good." That afternoon, David received a call from Dr. Harper asking him to come to the hospital immediately. When he arrived, he found her in her office with two men in expensive suits who didn't look like doctors or medical researchers. "David, these gentlemen are from a private research foundation," Dr. Harper said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with their presence. "They're interested in studying your techniques and possibly offering you a position with their organization." The older of the two men stepped forward and extended his hand.
Mr. Chen, I'm Dr. Richard Blackwood from the Institute for Advanced Medical Research. We've been following your work with great interest. David didn't shake the offered hand.
Something about these men made him deeply uncomfortable, and he trusted his instincts more than he trusted their polite words.
What kind of research are you interested in? David asked cautiously.
We're particularly interested in your ability to detect physiological changes that conventional monitoring equipment cannot measure, Dr. Blackwood replied. We believe that such abilities could be developed and applied in ways that would benefit many people. David noticed that the man hadn't really answered his question, and he sensed an undercurrent of deception in the conversation. These weren't medical researchers, they were something else entirely. I appreciate your interest, David said carefully, but I'm not looking for a new position right now. Dr. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but David caught something cold in his eyes. Of course. But perhaps you'd be willing to consult with us on specific cases? We would compensate you very generously for your time. I don't think so, David replied firmly. After David left, Dr. Harper found herself alone with the two visitors, and she didn't like what she saw in their expressions. Whatever these men represented, she was beginning to suspect that David had been right to refuse their offer. Dr. Harper, Dr. Blackwood said, I hope you'll encourage Mr. Chen to reconsider our offer. It would be unfortunate if his talents were wasted working as a simple paramedic. There was something threatening in his tone that made Dr. Harper very uncomfortable. Mr. Chen is an adult who can make his own decisions about his career. Of course, Dr. Blackwood replied. But sometimes people need help seeing what's in their best interests. That evening, David called his mentor from paramedic training, an older woman named Janet Miller who had 30 years of experience in emergency medicine. He trusted Janet's judgment and wanted her advice about the strange attention he had been receiving. David, I've been in this business for a long time, and I've never seen anything like what you did for Marcus Thompson, Janet said. But I've also never seen medical researchers act the way these people are acting. Legitimate researchers don't pressure people or make veiled threats. Janet went on to tell David about similar cases she had heard about over the years. People with unusual abilities who had attracted the wrong kind of attention and found themselves pressured into situations they couldn't control. My advice is to be very careful about who you trust, Janet said. And if you ever feel like you're in danger, don't hesitate to contact the police. Later that night, as David was preparing for bed, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. He looked through the peephole and saw two men in dark clothing standing near his door. They weren't making any attempt to knock or announce themselves, they were just waiting. David called 911 and reported suspicious activity, then gathered his grandfather's journals and the most important items from his apartment into a backpack. If these people were willing to stake out his home, then his situation had become more serious than he had realized. By the time the police arrived, the men in the hallway had disappeared. But David knew they would be back, and next time they might not be content to simply watch and wait. The young paramedic who had saved Marcus Thompson's life was now facing a choice that his grandfather had warned him about years earlier. He could try to hide his abilities and hope that the dangerous attention would fade away, or he could embrace his heritage and learn to protect himself using knowledge that had been passed down through generations of healers. Marcus Thompson was alive because David had chosen to use his gifts to save a life. Now David would have to decide whether those same gifts were worth risking his own life to protect. The quiet paramedic's greatest challenge was just beginning, and this time, there might not be anyone around to help him when his heart stopped beating.